We're continuing our discussion with author of the book, A Death in Panama, Ronald Williams. He's also a teacher, and it must be interesting to be able to also create material that can serve as an education process. So why don't you tell us about that end of it? Was it difficult, you know, keeping what you really believe out of the book as a teacher, or was it just exciting for you to see how students or individuals generally would respond to the book?
I don't usually think about my work as academic work. So I don't usually think of it as something that would be a teaching tool. I write fiction. It's designed to be popular fiction. That having been said, I think there's a lot in the book and in most of my books that people don't know about, for example, Barbados.
Exactly.
This relationship between the Caribbean generally and Panama is largely unknown to people under 50, probably even 60. But it was very significant. Think about it, the large movement of people into the black people into the Caribbean slavery. There's no movement out after that until Panama. The odd person left. But there's no mass movement out. 700,000 people moved from the Caribbean between about probably 1898 and about 1915 or so into Panama. The first mass movement out of the Caribbean. And that mass movement created something very different because Marcus Garvey, for example, whom I mentioned to you, Marcus Garvey was politicized or radicalized anyway in Panama. Then you find him in Harlem becoming the national leader in the United States. So many of the Caribbean folk would have gotten out of that first phase of colonialism largely through the experience in Panama, became much more radicalized. The conversation, an interesting conversation will be to contrast Caribbean black folk and African American folk in Panama. The behaviors were very different. And largely because the West Indians were British citizens, so when you messed with the West Indians, you created an international incident, which was very interesting because it gave you a voice that African Americans didn't have.
I see the book, though, as a teaching tool for that very reason, because, you know, it may not be an academic piece of literature, but there is a lot wrapped up in the very story, and you did the research. I mean, you could have kept it seriously fictional and just not do any background, just make it what your mind wanted it to be, but I think it's an experience that serves as a teaching tool nonetheless.
I agree, and I'm a teacher, by the way, only in the most general sense of the word. I haven't taught probably since the 80s. But I used to be a college president. Actually. But the research that was done, this is very interesting, and I want to comment about research, and this is not for you so much, but for potential writers, that the authenticity of the work comes through to the reader, even if the reader doesn't know the scene. They can feel when it's real. But the research for Panama was really fascinating. I spent a good deal of time there, and you discover so many things along the way. For example, you can get some of the best cocoa in the world in Panama City.
Tell that to my mother.
And my mother can cook cocoa, okay? So when I say that, I say it as an expert. But in La Boca, in Panama City, you can still find some of the best Caribbean food in outside, I guess, of the Caribbean. So it's pretty exciting.
I want to go to that and touch on that a little bit. What is the feeling of those who remain, or those families that were built up in Panama towards the West Indian people from the Caribbean?
It ranges. When I talked to the older people when I was there was still a sense of connectivity. For the most part, the younger people identify as Latinos, as Hispanics, as Panamanians. But the older people still had that sense of connectivity. One of the weird experiences I had, I was in Colón on the eastern side, and I was in the Zona Franca trying to buy something, and I heard this country Jamaican accent. This kid, he looked like about 18. Not the sophisticated Jamaican accent you heard earlier. It was really. So I walked over, and I hadn't heard English for a while, so I walked over to this kid, and I said, as soon as I spoke to him, he switched back into Spanish. But the Spanish was educated, sophisticated Spanish. And here's the story. His grandmother came from Jamaica. The only English he knew and spoke was that English, and she was from Westmoreland. So he spoke that kind of English, but once he went back to Spanish, it was sophisticated. And I tell the story to suggest the disconnect in the sense that the younger West Indians or people of West Indian extraction would have from that original society.
Okay.
You know, you spoke a bit about the way the extraction of men
Right.
from a society changes its dynamic and creates essentially a matriarchal society. As the great-granddaughter of a man who worked on the Panama Canal as well, I lived that experience. I want you to tell me a bit about how that is played out as life imitating art and art imitating life, but we're going to come back to you for the remainder of that answer just after the news and sports.